where faith, inspiration, and storytelling come together to bring the Bible to life like never before. Our mission is to take you on a spiritual journey through the Bible's stories, from the creation in Genesis to the revelations of the end times. Welcome to Timeless Bible Journeys.
Welcome to Timeless Bible Journeys, where we bring ancient stories to life and uncover the timeless wisdom they hold. Have you ever faced betrayal by those closest to you, or experienced a setback so devastating that it felt like your entire world was crumbling? Imagine being sold into slavery by your own family, falsely accused of a crime you didn't commit, and thrown into prison, only to rise to power and change the course of history. This is the story of Joseph, one of the most remarkable figures in the Bible. His journey is not just a tale of survival, but a testament to resilience, faith, and the power of forgiveness. From a young boy adored by his father to a man betrayed by his own brothers, Joseph's life took unexpected turns, yet every twist led him closer to his destiny. But what makes Joseph's story so important? Why has it been told and retold for thousands of years across different cultures and religions? His life is more than just an ancient narrative. It is a profound lesson in how adversity can shape us, how forgiveness can heal, and how even in the darkest moments, a greater plan may be unfolding. Today, we will dive deep into Joseph's journey, from the colorful coat that sparked jealousy to his rise as Egypt's most powerful leader after Pharaoh. Along the way, we'll uncover the hidden messages and life lessons that continue to inspire millions. So, if you've ever wondered whether hardships serve a greater purpose, or if forgiveness is truly possible after deep betrayal, then stay with us. And before we begin, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these incredible stories to life. Now, let's embark on the journey of Joseph, a story of pain, perseverance, and the ultimate triumph of destiny. The favored son and a coat of many colors. Imagine growing up in a large family, 12 brothers, each competing for their father's love and attention. Now, imagine that among all of them, one brother is clearly the favorite. That was Joseph. Joseph was the 11th son of Jacob, but he held a special place in his father's heart. Why? Because he was the firstborn of Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife. Unlike his other sons who were born from different wives and concubines, Joseph was a symbol of Jacob's deepest love. And Jacob made no effort to hide his favoritism. To show his affection, Jacob gave Joseph a magnificent robe. Some translations call it a coat of many colors, while others describe it as a long-sleeved tunic, a sign of status and honor. In any case, the meaning was clear. Joseph was different. He was set apart. But favoritism breeds resentment, and for Joseph's brothers, that resentment quickly turned into jealousy, and then into hatred. As if being their father's favorite wasn't bad enough, Joseph had another trait that made him stand out. He was a dreamer. But these weren't ordinary dreams. They were prophetic, filled with symbolism, and they all pointed to one thing: Joseph's future rise to power. One night, Joseph had a dream that he and his brothers were binding sheaves of grain in the field. Suddenly, his sheaf stood upright, while the others bowed down to it. When he told his brothers, their anger flared. "Do you think you're going to reign over us?" they scoffed. But then came a second dream. This time even bigger. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing before Joseph. The meaning was unmistakable. Not just his brothers, but even his parents would one day acknowledge his greatness. Even Jacob, who loved Joseph deeply, was taken aback. "Will your mother and I actually bow down to you?" he asked. But deep down, Jacob knew there was something different about his son. Joseph's dreams weren't just wild imagination. They were glimpses of the future. But to his brothers, They felt like arrogance, a challenge, an insult. With every passing day, their resentment grew. What gave Joseph the right to be favored, to wear that extravagant coat, to dream of ruling over them? And so a dangerous thought began to take root in their minds. Joseph had to be stopped. Little did they know that the very thing they feared, his rise to power, was already set in motion. Their betrayal would not destroy him. It would only push him closer to his destiny. From brother to slave, betrayed and sold. Jealousy is a dangerous thing. What starts as quiet resentment can grow into something far more destructive. For Joseph's brothers, their envy had festered for years. But one fateful day, their anger boiled over into an unthinkable act. They betrayed their own flesh and blood. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers, who were tending their flocks near Dothan. Oblivious to the danger ahead, Joseph set out, wearing his prized coat of many colors, the very symbol of his father's favoritism. When his brothers saw him approaching in the distance, their hatred took over. "Here comes that dreamer," one of them sneered. "Let's kill him and see what becomes of his dreams." It wasn't just anger speaking. It was a deliberate plan. Joseph wasn't just an annoying little brother to them. He was a threat. If his dreams were true, one day he would rule over them. And that was something they refused to accept. But not all of them were ready for murder. Reuben, the eldest brother, tried to stop them. Instead of killing Joseph, he suggested throwing him into a dry pit, planning to rescue him later. The others agreed. When Joseph arrived, the attack was swift. They ripped off his coat, the very thing that reminded them of their father's favoritism, and threw him into the pit, alone, helpless, betrayed. As they sat down to eat, debating what to do next, a caravan of Ishmaelite traders approached. Their camels were loaded with spices and goods, headed for Egypt. That's when Judah, another brother, had an idea. What will we gain if we kill him? Instead, let's sell him to these traders. And so, for just 20 pieces of silver, the price of a common slave, Joseph was sold, his fate no longer in his own hands. Can you imagine the terror Joseph must have felt? One moment he was his father's beloved son, wrapped in a robe of honor. The next, he was bound, led away by strangers, heading toward an unknown future. His cries for mercy fell on deaf ears. His own family had cast him away like he was nothing. With Joseph gone, the brothers had to cover their tracks. They took his coat, dipped it in goat's blood, and brought it to their father. "Look at this," they said. "Is this your son's robe?" Jacob's heart shattered. Seeing the blood-stained garment, he assumed the worst. A wild animal had devoured his son. Overcome with grief, he tore his clothes, wept bitterly, and refused to be comforted. Meanwhile, Joseph was on his way to Egypt, a land of strange gods and foreign customs. He had lost everything: his family, his freedom, his identity. But what his brothers meant for harm, God would use for good. Because Joseph's story was far from over. Rising in Egypt, then falling again. The journey to Egypt must have been terrifying for Joseph. Just days ago, he was the beloved son of a wealthy patriarch. Now he was a slave, stripped of his dignity, forced to walk alongside merchants who saw him as nothing more than property. When the caravan arrived in Egypt, Joseph was sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the royal guard. Potiphar was a powerful man, and Joseph was now just another servant in his vast household. But Joseph had something that set him apart: wisdom, integrity, and an unshakable faith in God. Despite his tragic circumstances, Joseph refused to be defeated. He worked hard, proved himself trustworthy, and soon caught Potiphar's attention. The Egyptian officials saw that everything Joseph touched seemed to prosper. Recognizing his abilities, Potiphar promoted Joseph, putting him in charge of his entire household. Joseph, once a slave, was now managing one of the most powerful estates in Egypt. Under his leadership, everything flourished. The crops yielded more. The servants worked efficiently. Potiphar trusted Joseph completely, giving him full control over his affairs. It seemed that, despite his brother's betrayal, Joseph's life was finally turning around. But just when things seemed to be going well, disaster struck. Joseph was young, strong, and handsome, and Potiphar's wife took notice. Day after day, she tried to seduce him, urging him to betray his master's trust. But Joseph refused. "How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" he told her. But she wouldn't take no for an answer. One day, when Joseph was alone in the house, she grabbed him by his cloak and demanded he sleep with her. Knowing the danger, Joseph did the only thing he could. He ran. But as he fled, his cloak slipped from his shoulders and remained in her hands. Furious at being rejected, Potiphar's wife twisted the story. She screamed, accusing Joseph of trying to assault her. When Potiphar heard the accusation, his anger burned. Without a trial, without hearing Joseph's side, he had him thrown into prison. From the heights of success to the depths of a dungeon. Just like that, Joseph lost everything. Again, one moment he was a trusted leader in Potiphar's house. The next he was shackled and thrown into a dark, filthy Egyptian prison. Imagine the despair he must have felt. He had done everything right, worked hard, remained faithful, resisted temptation, and still life seemed to conspire against him. But Joseph's story wasn't over. Even in the darkest place, his destiny was still unfolding. And soon, Egypt would need him more than ever. From prison to Pharaoh's right hand, Joseph had lost everything: his freedom, his reputation, and his future. Thrown into the cold, dark cells of an Egyptian prison, he was now at the lowest point of his life. But even in prison, Joseph was not forgotten. Unlike most prisoners, Joseph refused to sink into despair. He remained faithful, worked hard, and carried himself with integrity. Soon the prison warden took notice. Just as Potiphar had seen Joseph's abilities, so did the warden. He put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners, trusting him to manage the affairs of the prison. Even in chains, Joseph's leadership and wisdom set him apart. It seemed that no matter where life placed him, a slave's home or a dungeon, Joseph always rose to the top. But what he didn't know was that his next opportunity would come in the most unexpected way, through a dream. One day, two high-ranking officials from Pharaoh's court, his cupbearer and his chief baker, were thrown into the same prison as Joseph. Both had fallen out of Pharaoh's favor, and their futures were uncertain. One night, each of them had a strange and troubling dream. When Joseph noticed their distress the next morning, he asked them, "Why do you look so sad today?" They explained that they had both dreamt unusual dreams, but had no one to interpret them. Joseph, knowing that his ability to interpret dreams came from God, told them, "Interpretations belong to God. Tell me your dreams." The cupbearer went first. In his dream, he saw a vine with 3 branches, which blossomed and produced grapes. He squeezed the grapes into Pharaoh's cup and handed it to him. Joseph explained, "The 3 branches represent 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will restore you to your position." Encouraged by this good news, the baker shared his dream next. He had seen 3 baskets of bread on his head, but birds were eating from the top basket. Joseph's interpretation was far less hopeful. The 3 baskets also mean 3 days, but in 3 days, Pharaoh will have you executed. 3 days later, both interpretations came true. The cupbearer was restored to his role, and the baker was put to death. Before the cupbearer left prison, Joseph made one request. "Please remember me when you are back in Pharaoh's court. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison." But once free, the cupbearer forgot all about Joseph. 2 years passed. Joseph remained in prison, forgotten. But then something happened. Pharaoh had a dream. It wasn't just one dream, but two, and they were deeply unsettling. In the first, Pharaoh saw 7 fat, healthy cows emerge from the Nile, only to be devoured by 7 thin, sickly cows. In the second dream, 7 plump ears of grain were swallowed up by 7 thin, withered ones. None of Pharaoh's magicians or wise men could explain the meaning. And that's when the cupbearer finally remembered Joseph. He told Pharaoh about the Hebrew prisoner who had accurately interpreted dreams 2 years earlier. Immediately, Pharaoh summoned Joseph from prison. After years of suffering, Joseph now stood before the most powerful man in Egypt. Pharaoh said, "I have heard that you can interpret dreams." Joseph humbly replied, "I cannot, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he seeks." Then Joseph explained, the 7 fat cows and the 7 healthy ears of grain represented 7 years of abundance in Egypt. The 7 thin cows and the 7 withered ears of grain represented 7 years of famine that would follow. Joseph warned Pharaoh that the famine would be so severe that it would erase all memory of the good years. But he didn't just interpret the dream. He offered a solution. Let Pharaoh appoint a wise and discerning man to store up grain during the 7 years of plenty, so that Egypt will have food during the famine. Pharaoh was astonished. Not only did Joseph interpret the dream, but he also presented a plan to save the entire kingdom. Turning to his officials, Pharaoh asked, "Can we find anyone like this man, in whom is the Spirit of God?" And then, in a moment that changed Joseph's life forever, Pharaoh declared, "You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people will obey your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." In an instant, Joseph went from prisoner to the second most powerful man in Egypt. Pharaoh gave him his royal signet ring, dressed him in fine linen, and placed a gold chain around his neck. Joseph was now Pharaoh's right hand, the Grand Vizier of Egypt. At just 30 years old, the boy who had once been sold for 20 pieces of silver was now ruling over an empire. But Joseph's greatest challenge was yet to come, because soon his past would come knocking at his door, bringing with it the very brothers who had betrayed him. A family reunion and a test of character. For 7 years, Egypt flourished under Joseph's leadership. Grain storehouses overflowed and the kingdom prospered. But just as Joseph had predicted, the years of plenty came to an end. Then came the famine, harsh, unrelenting, and widespread. It stretched far beyond Egypt, devastating lands to the east, including Canaan, Joseph's homeland. Back in Canaan, Joseph's father, Jacob, and his brothers were struggling to survive. With their food supplies dwindling, Jacob heard that Egypt still had grain, and so he made a decision that would change everything. "Go down to Egypt and buy grain, so that we may live and not die." 10 of Joseph's brothers set out for Egypt, leaving their youngest brother Benjamin behind with Jacob. When they arrived, they were taken before Egypt's powerful governor, the very man in charge of all the food. They had no idea that this Egyptian ruler was their own brother, Joseph. But Joseph recognized them immediately. He saw the same faces that had once betrayed him, the same brothers who had ripped off his coat, thrown him into a pit, and sold him as a slave. They didn't recognize him. How could they? He was no longer the young, helpless boy they had abandoned. He was now a powerful Egyptian leader, dressed in royal garments, speaking a foreign language through an interpreter. And then, in a moment of irony, they bowed before him, just as Joseph had once dreamed they would. Joseph could have revealed himself instantly, but instead he chose to test them. Were they still the same jealous, cruel men from years ago, or had time changed them? He accused them of being spies, coming to Egypt to uncover its weaknesses. Frightened, they insisted they were honest men, 12 brothers, though one was no more, and the youngest remained with their father. Joseph seized the opportunity. He demanded, "If you are telling the truth, bring your youngest brother here. Until then, one of you will stay in prison." Simeon was taken as a hostage, and the rest returned to Canaan with grain, but also with fear. Back in Canaan, Jacob was devastated. He had already lost Joseph. Now Simeon was gone, and the Egyptian governor demanded Benjamin, his youngest and most beloved son. "Everything is against me," Jacob cried. But as the famine worsened, he had no choice. Benjamin had to go. Judah, the very brother who once suggested selling Joseph into slavery, made a bold promise. "I will take personal responsibility for him. If I do not bring him back, you can hold me accountable forever." And so the brothers returned to Egypt, this time with Benjamin. Seeing Benjamin, his only full-blooded brother, overwhelmed Joseph with emotion. He had to step away to weep in private. Still, the final test remained. He prepared a feast for them, treating Benjamin with extra kindness. Then, as they were leaving, he ordered his silver cup to be hidden inside Benjamin's grain sack. As the brothers departed, Joseph's steward chased them down. "Why have you stolen my master's silver cup?" he accused. The brothers were shocked. "We would never do such a thing. If any of us has the cup, let him be put to death." But when the sacks were searched, the cup was found in Benjamin's bag. Devastated, they returned to Joseph's palace. This was the moment Joseph had been waiting for. Would they abandon Benjamin to save themselves, just as they had abandoned him years ago? Then something incredible happened. Judah stepped forward. This was the same Judah who once suggested selling Joseph. But now he spoke not with selfishness, but with love and responsibility. "Please, my lord," he begged, "let me take Benjamin's place. If we return without him, our father will die of sorrow." Judah was willing to sacrifice himself for his brother. At that moment, Joseph knew they had changed. His brothers were no longer the same men who had betrayed him. They had learned love, responsibility, and the pain of loss. Joseph could hold back no longer. Tears streamed down his face. The test was over. It was time to reveal the truth. The bigger plan. What you meant for evil, God used for good. The room was silent. Joseph could no longer hold back his emotions. His brothers stood before him, unaware that the Egyptian ruler they feared was the very brother they had once betrayed. Suddenly, Joseph wept so loudly that even Pharaoh's household heard him. His sobs weren't just from years of pain. They were from overwhelming love, from the realization that everything had led to this moment. Through tears, he finally spoke the words that changed everything. "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" His brothers froze. Shock, fear, guilt, all flooded their faces. This was impossible. Joseph was alive. The brother they sold into slavery now ruled Egypt. They couldn't even answer. Terror gripped them. Surely Joseph would take his revenge. But what Joseph said next was not words of anger, but of grace. "Come closer," he told them. As they stepped forward, he reassured them. "Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves for selling me, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." In that moment, Joseph saw the greater purpose behind his suffering. His brothers had meant to harm him, but God had used it for good. Had Joseph not been sold into slavery, he wouldn't have ended up in Egypt. Had he not been falsely accused, he wouldn't have been in prison. Had he not been in prison, he wouldn't have met the cupbearer. Had he not met the cupbearer, he wouldn't have interpreted Pharaoh's dream. Had he not interpreted Pharaoh's dream, Egypt wouldn't have been prepared for the famine. And if Egypt hadn't stored food, thousands, including his own family, would have perished. Every trial, every betrayal had led to this moment of salvation. "It was not you who sent me here, but God," Joseph said. This was forgiveness in its purest form, not just letting go of pain, but understanding that even in suffering, a divine plan was unfolding. Joseph's love for his family was greater than his desire for justice. Instead of punishment, he offered provision. "Go back to Canaan. Bring my father and your families. You will live in the land of Goshen, where I will provide for you." When Pharaoh heard about Joseph's brothers, he welcomed them with open arms and offered them the best land in Egypt. The brothers rushed back to Canaan to deliver the news. At first, Jacob couldn't believe it. His son, whom he had mourned for years, was alive. But when he saw the wagons Joseph had sent, his heart leaped. "Joseph, my son is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." Jacob and his entire household, 70 in total, moved to Egypt, where they were reunited with Joseph. After years of separation, father and son embraced, weeping tears of joy. Joseph's story wasn't just about his personal rise. It was about God's faithfulness, about turning evil into good, about forgiveness over revenge. Years later, after Jacob passed away, Joseph's brothers feared that he might finally take revenge. But Joseph reassured them once more. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." This wasn't just Joseph's story. It was the story of grace, redemption, and a greater plan at work. And that is why, thousands of years later, his story continues to inspire us today. Lessons learned. Joseph's story is more than just an ancient tale. It's a timeless lesson in faith, resilience, and forgiveness. From betrayal to slavery, from false accusations to imprisonment, his life was filled with hardship. Yet, through every trial, Joseph never lost hope. So, what can we learn from his journey? 1. Pain has a purpose. Sometimes, life takes us through unexpected hardships. Joseph didn't understand why he was suffering, but in the end, he saw that every setback was part of a bigger plan. What seems like a tragedy today may be the very thing that leads to your greatest success. 2. Forgiveness is greater than revenge. Joseph had every reason to hate his brothers, but instead of seeking revenge, he chose grace. He understood that true strength lies not in punishing those who hurt us, but in releasing the burden of bitterness. 3. The integrity always wins. Even when no one was watching, Joseph remained honest, loyal, and hardworking. In Potiphar's house, in prison, and in Pharaoh's court, he stayed true to his principles. And that integrity ultimately led to his rise. 4. What others mean for harm, God can use for good. Joseph's brothers intended to destroy him, but God turned their evil into a blessing. No matter what challenges you face, remember, your struggles may be shaping you for something greater than you can imagine. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever faced a challenge that later turned into a blessing? And don't forget, like, share, and subscribe for more incredible journeys through history and scripture. Until next time, this is Timeless Bible Journeys, reminding you that every trial carries the seed of a greater purpose.